The grand bronze doors of the Jefferson Hall of History swung open at precisely 10 a.m., admitting a small group of 20 visitors into the hushed marble foyer. Among them was Malik Thompson, the museum's newest and youngest lead guide. At 29, he carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew his story mattered. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer embroidered with the museum's emblem, he waited at the head of the line, ebony skin glowing beneath the soft uplights. Most of the visitors were white, retirees clutching audio guides, young families balancing strollers, college students clutching notebooks. They expected the usual fare: a polished parade through gilded portraits of founding fathers, triumphalist tableau of westward expansion, and half-whispered accounts of social progress. As Malik stepped forward, his voice, deep, measured, and certain, echoed off the marble walls. "Welcome to Jefferson Hall," he began. "Today's tour will follow a different path than you might expect. We'll explore not only what's painted on these canvases, but what's been erased from them." A ripple of curious glances passed through the group. Mrs. Patterson, a gray-haired librarian, raised an eyebrow. The university students exchanged amused smirks. Malik led them into Gallery 3, where a monumental oil painting depicted a smiling President Jackson accepting the surrender of native chiefs. Malik paused before it, tapping the protective glass. "This image," he said, "was commissioned in 1860 to recast forced removal as benevolence. But no mural tells that story. Over 4,000 Cherokees died on the Trail of Tears." He let the words hang. A hush fell. Some faces flushed. Bodies shifted uncomfortably. Moving on, Malik stopped by a polished mahogany case containing the original draft of the 13th Amendment. "They tell us this abolished slavery," he said, voice calm. "True, but it also included a loophole permitting involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. Over 150 years later, that clause fuels mass incarceration disproportionately targeting black communities. The very document we revere contains its own contradiction." Whispers rose. A father furrowed his brow. A student jotted furiously. In the next alcove, Malik unveiled a secret. Literally, he pressed a hidden switch, and a darkened panel slid aside to reveal sepia photographs of black laborers tearing down the palace of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, long omitted from the museum's Civil War exhibit. "These men rebuilt our nation's capital," Malik said softly, "yet their names were scrubbed from our textbooks and from this museum until just last year." Several visitors gasped. A mother pulled her daughter closer. The daughter's eyes widened at the sight of defiant faces long hidden. As the tour progressed, Malik wove in his own family history. His great-grandmother, once enslaved, who taught herself to read by candlelight. His grandfather, a Pullman porter who organized for fair wages. His mother, a school teacher who marched in the first integration sit-ins. The group trailed him through echoing halls, absorbing each revelation. By the time they reached the Grand Rotunda, where a statue of the city's founding merchant stood atop a marble plinth, the polished veneer of history had cracked. Malik's final question hung in the cavernous space. What does it mean to honor our heritage when that heritage is built on hidden injustice? Several visitors, once comfortably nodding at heroic legends, stood motionless, eyes tracing Malik's silhouette against the statue's shadow. The unfiltered truths he'd shared had unsettled their assumptions, forcing them to confront the biases baked into every artifact. And as they gazed upward, Malik Thompson realized that opening these doors of perception was just the beginning. The real work would be carried home, into conversations that may prove far more challenging than any tour through a museum's silent halls. After a brief recess in the marble-clad lobby, the group reconvened under the soaring dome, hushed and uneasy. Malik guided them back into Gallery 5, where a series of grand portraits showcased industrial titans, white men in opulent waistcoats, gazing confidently at smokestack horizons. "And notice anything familiar?" Malik asked, gesturing to the gleaming panels. A few heads nodded, others looked puzzled. He tapped the nearest portrait of steel magnate Charles Whitmore. Whitmore's wealth was built on black labor, enslaved in the Deep South and later exploited in unregulated factories. Yet here he stands alone, smiling as if his fortune sprang from thin air. A murmur rose near the back of the group. An older man in a tweed jacket muttered, "That's ancient history. You can't judge a man by standards 2 centuries old." Malik met his gaze. "History isn't ancient. It's the soil in which our present grows. If we ignore the roots, we remain blind to the harvest we reap. His eyes swept the crowd. These portraits omit the workers who toiled under brutal conditions so that these men could amass fortunes. Their stories were never deemed worthy of hanging on these walls. Several visitors exchanged shifting glances. A middle-aged woman folded her arms. So you'd have pictures of anonymous laborers instead of founders? Malik nodded thoughtfully. Both. We can and should display the earnings alongside the engines that powered them. The human lives, the child laborers, the union organizers beaten for speaking out. Only then does the picture become whole. He led the group to a newly installed interactive kiosk. On its touchscreen, archival photographs flickered. Black children assembling textiles in cramped mills, immigrant laborers panning for gold, women and men marching for an 8-hour day. Each image carried a testimonial read aloud through concealed speakers. The hush deepened as visitors pressed each photo, listening to voices once silenced. As they moved deeper into the gallery, Malik paused before a towering column of names engraved in dark stone. This cenotaph, he said, voice soft, lists every worker killed in industrial accidents between 1880 and 1920. Over 7,000 souls. Only 5 were executives. The rest were migrant workers, black sharecroppers turned factory hands, and children no older than 10. Jasmine Pierce, a university student, wiped her eyes. I had no idea, she whispered. Around her, even the skeptics seemed affected. Their shoulders slumped, their cheeks pale. The group pressed on to Gallery 7, dedicated to the Civil Rights era. Here, Malik stopped before a well-known photograph of President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act. Notice who's missing, Malik said, pointing to the empty spaces that once held portraits of grassroots activists, Fannie Lou Hamer, Bayard Rustin, Diane Nash, whose names now scrolled on a digital wall beside the painting. An elderly couple standing nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks. The husband cleared his throat. I remember learning all about Johnson in school, but not these. These local heroes. Malik nodded. History textbooks often spotlight the figureheads, the presidents, the legislators, while sidelining the organizers who risked everything on the front lines. Our museum's new approach is to center those very risk-takers, so that their courage can guide us today. As the tour neared its end, Malik motioned toward a semicircular alcove where a long bench awaited. Let's sit and talk, he invited. Visitors settled, some stiffly, others more receptive. Malik took a seat at the center. He began a Q&A. What surprised you most? Hands shot up. The librarian from the first day confessed tears over the industrial cenotaph. A young father admitted discomfort at realizing the unacknowledged debt his ancestors owed. A retired teacher pressed Malik on how to integrate these fuller narratives into local school curricula. Then the tweed-jacketed man cleared his throat again. You've shattered our rose-tinted view. But what now? How do we move forward? Malik smiled gently. Awareness is only the first step. Next comes action. I encourage each of you to commit to one personal pledge. To share these untold stories with others, to advocate for inclusive curricula in our schools, or to support organizations preserving labor and civil rights histories. He held up small cards, printed with 3 prompts: tell a story, teach a lesson, take a stand, asking each visitor to choose one before they dispersed. As the group rose to leave, the atmosphere was changed. No longer passive consumers of sanitized history, they emerged thoughtful, unsettled, and determined. Outside the gallery, Malik handed out museum membership brochures that highlighted volunteer docent programs focused on unfiltered narratives. By the end of the day, several guests had already emailed local school boards, formed study groups, and pledged to return as volunteer guides. The museum's phones buzzed with inquiries. Social media lit up with praise and thoughtful dialogue. And as Malik watched the bronze doors close behind the last of the tour group, he knew the real work had only just begun, transforming shock into shared responsibility and opening minds as wide as the museum's hallowed halls. Malik led the group into Gallery 9, where the subdued glow of spotlights illuminated a silver-plated plow and a bank ledger bound in cracked leather. On the wall beside these artifacts hung a single phrase, stenciled in bold red letters: built on bondage, profits in blood. Visitors clustered around the display, brows furrowed. Malik's voice cut through the hush. This ledger records the profits of the cotton trade in New Orleans. Profits invested directly into the earliest stock offerings on Wall Street. The plow belonged to the plantation's enslaved field hands, whose names were never recorded. A middle-aged woman in the front gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I had no idea our economy was so entwined with slavery," she whispered. Nearby, a young man with an expensive camera lowered it, eyes glistening with disbelief. Malik nodded gravely. Understanding the true origins of our institutions isn't comfortable, but it's essential if we're ever to dismantle the myths they uphold. Next, Malik guided them to a circular projection room, where 24 leather stools awaited. He gestured for the group to sit as the lights dimmed and a 360-degree film flickered to life. The camera panned across a reconstructed sharecropper cabin, then dissolved into the cramped cell blocks of a convict leasing prison. A narrator's voice, drawn from oral histories, recounted how states leased predominantly black prisoners to industrial magnates for virtually no pay. The walls pulsed with the sound of clanking chains and low, mournful chants. Tears glistened on the cheeks of several visitors. One man's shoulders shook with silent sobs. When the projection ended, Malik invited discussion. A college student raised her hand. "I'd only read about convict leasing in textbooks. Seeing it like that, I feel complicit in ignorance." The elderly librarian added, "I've lived here 50 years and never heard these stories. How do we begin to atone?" Malik handed out small cards stamped "Your Next Step," each listing a concrete action: support a local reparation initiative, volunteer with prison education programs, or lobby for the removal of monuments celebrating oppressors. As visitors wrote down their pledges, the murmurs of reflection grew louder. A distinguished businessman approached Malik last, pressing a folded note into his hand. "Thank you for this unfiltered truth," he said quietly. "I'll use my resources to fund an educational endowment in my grandfather's name, one that tells these stories honestly." As they exited into the bright corridor, the group was visibly transformed, posture straighter, expression solemn, yet resolute. Late that afternoon, Malik watched visitors leave through the grand bronze doors. Some paused to speak with him directly. Others lingered in front of the very exhibits that had shocked them. But everyone carried away the weight and the promise of confronting bias, not as a distant issue, but as a shared responsibility woven into the fabric of their own history. The next morning, Jefferson Hall's staff gathered for an unprecedented meeting, plans to integrate Malik's Unfiltered tour into the museum's permanent programming. Curators, educators, and administrators filed into the glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city skyline. At the head of the table stood Dr. Elena Morales, the museum director, who cleared her throat. "Malik's tour has sparked a powerful conversation," she began. "But our goal is to move beyond dialogue to concrete change, both inside these walls and out in the community." She unveiled a 3-phase initiative: curriculum overhaul. Over the coming year, school group tours would receive a newly designed truth transformation curriculum. Lessons would include primary source workshops, role-playing exercises on historical empathy, and field trips to descendant communities. Community partnerships. The museum would partner with local churches, labor unions, and civil rights organizations to host history and action events, town halls where residents could share family archives, propose new exhibits, and shape the museum's narrative. Reparative exhibits. Within 6 months, the museum would open a dedicated gallery, confronting capitalism and oppression, featuring rotating installations on labor resistance, reparations movements, and global anti-colonial struggles. Malik watched as curators took notes, educators offered enthusiastic support, and the legal team discussed funding and donor outreach. The room crackled with purpose. That afternoon, Malik stood before a bustling classroom of 4th graders from Jefferson Elementary. Their faces lit by curiosity, the children leaned in as he unveiled a replica cotton ledger and a simple chart showing how enslaved labor fueled the city's early banks. "When we erase these stories," Malik told them gently, "it's like reading only half a book. Today, we read the whole story." He handed each child a blank story tile to illustrate someone in their family's past: a bakery owner, a school teacher, a factory worker, so their family histories could be displayed alongside the museum's exhibits. As spring flowers bloomed in the museum courtyard, the first History in Action Town Hall convened under white canopies. Descendants of factory workers, formerly incarcerated individuals, and community activists gathered around Malik and Dr. Morales. One elderly union leader passed around black and white photos of strike marches. A librarian shared oral history recordings of segregated swimming pools. Each story deepened the museum's understanding of its city's past and its duty in shaping a more just future. By early summer, the new reparative gallery opened with much fanfare. Titled From Chains to Change, its entrance arch bore the inscription, "Acknowledging our past is the first act of courage. Forging justice is the work of our hands." Inside, visitors encountered immersive installations, a room of suspended steel chains symbolizing the commodity of human bodies, an interactive map tracing the roots of the convict leasing companies, and a digital touchscreen where they could pledge support for local reparations legislation. Malik's tours operated hourly, drawing standing room-only crowds. A white high school teacher told him afterward, "You gave my students the language to demand better textbooks and the courage to speak out in class." That evening, Malik met with Dr. Morales in her office. They reviewed the quarterly report. Museum attendance up 35%, community memberships doubled, and 28 local schools had adopted the Truth and Transformation curriculum. Even private donors pledged funding for future reparative exhibits. Dr. Morales smiled, eyes shining. What began as a single unfiltered tour has reshaped our institution's mission. You've shown us how to use history not as a boast, but as a beacon. Malik nodded, thinking of the countless visitors whose perceptions had shifted, from polite curiosity to active engagement. He understood then that true justice demanded both truth-telling and tangible action. And as he left the museum under the soft glow of lanterns in the courtyard, he carried with him the lesson that when history is laid bare, the path to repair begins, one unflinching story at a time. Summer's humidity still lingered in the air when Jefferson Hall's initiative reached its most ambitious milestone, the Unfiltered History Traveling Exhibit. Malik stood at the lobby's entrance as the first of 10 custom-built display cases was wheeled through the bronze doors and into the museum's historic carriage house. Each case housed a replica artifact, indentured servitude contracts, convict leasing receipts, child labor safety violations, paired with interactive stations where visitors could record their own family histories or pledge support for local justice campaigns. When the bell chimed opening, a flood of families, tourists, and school groups streamed inside. Malik's voice rose above the crowd. "Here you see the documents they once hid. Here you decide what we do next." He guided an elderly couple through the first station, the New Orleans Cotton Ledger, then paused to help a group of middle schoolers navigate the touchscreen map of child labor factories. One girl gasped as she tapped a hidden button labeled Voices of the Voiceless, triggering a cascade of oral history clips from descendants of factory workers. Over the next weeks, the exhibit traveled to libraries, veterans halls, and community centers across the county. Malik flew to the state capitol for the grand launch at the governor's mansion, where his introductory remarks set a tone of shared responsibility. "We cannot relegate this history to dusty archives. We must carry it into our schools, our town halls, our homes." State legislators announced a commission to update public school textbooks. The Department of Education invited Malik to serve on its advisory board. Back in the museum, Malik watched as staff volunteers from diverse backgrounds, suburban retirees, college interns, immigrant families, served as docents for the traveling exhibit. Each person's unique perspective enriched the tour's conversations. A white retiree confessed tears over untold labor deaths. A Latinx community organizer proposed bilingual walking tours. A young Muslim student drafted plans for a special session on North African labor and American railroad construction. Every insight sparked another layer of engagement. On a humid September evening, Malik joined Dr. Elena Morales for the unveiling of the museum's new annual Truth and Transformation lecture series. They welcomed a panel of former child workers turned human rights lawyers, a descendant of sharecroppers who founded a microloan cooperative, and a nationally renowned curator who reinterpreted classical masterpieces through the lens of reparative justice. The standing room-only crowd erupted in applause as Malik closed the event. "We've learned that history's power isn't in what it hides, but in how it compels us to build a fairer future." Months later, As autumn's first golden leaves drifted past the museum's stately columns, Malik reflected on the journey from that first unfiltered tour. The grand portrait galleries remained, but now their polished veneer rested atop layers of truth. Each exhibited story a bridge to deeper understanding. Outside, community members gathered weekly for story circles in the courtyard, swapping family narratives against the backdrop of Jefferson Hall's illuminated facade. And inside, the museum's catalog boasted record membership and an unprecedented 50% increase in youth engagement programs. Standing at the threshold of the grand bronze doors one crisp morning, Malik realized that justice, like history, was never a fixed monument, but a living work in progress. Each visitor who left changed just a little, carrying new stories into the world beyond the marble halls. And as he opened the doors to welcome another group, Malik knew the real legacy of his unfiltered tour. A community awakened, ready to confront bias, not just in exhibits, but in every corner of their shared past and intertwined future.